Thank you very much for coming here tonight to discuss with us a very important topic, which is arms control and disarmament and the opportunities and challenges that the European Union is facing in this respect. Before we proceed with our main part of the discussion, I would like to say that this public event is hosted within the framework of a larger project sponsored by the European Union. The project is organized by COST-ENTER, a network of organizations and universities around Europe, as well as by the IIP and the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. We had the whole day of discussions today already here, and we will continue tomorrow. And tonight we would like also to share the expertise that we have here during these 2 days with you, with the audience in Vienna. We have a very prominent and excellent panel here tonight. I would like to introduce all of them maybe slowly, one after another. Before maybe we start with their introductory remarks, I would like to maybe set the scene for the main developments in arms control and disarmament in the last years, which unfortunately are not very successful, were not very positive in the last years. In 2015, the NPT review conference ended without any final document, and in the subsequent years we had a series of events that actually further delayed any progress on disarmament. We can mention the abrogation of the INF Treaty, the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA, nuclear tests by North Korea, and series of other events. There is also still a question remaining whether the New START treaty will be extended next year when it expires. And this all actually is a big issue for the European Union, because many of the arms control agreements are actually meant, or used to be, were meant to protect the European continent from any sort of nuclear conflict happening here. That's why I would like to first pose a general question to all the speakers. What are your assessments of the recent years of how the non-proliferation regime worked, and what should we expect in future, and especially in April, May at the NPT review conference in New York? I would like to start with Angela Kane, the Vice President of the International Institute for Peace and former UN Commissioner for Disarmament. Angela, please.
Thank you very much, Maria. Is it working? Yeah. And thank you all for coming. I see some very good friends and high-ranking officials here who are experts in disarmament and non-proliferation. And I know that you also will have a good contribution to make at the discussion area when we come to this. I want to make some first remarks, and I think Maria had already touched on a number of the issues that are really concerning all of us at the moment. And what is the situation that we are facing at present? I mean, it's not only the collapse and abrogation of several important arms control agreements, like the INF, like the JCPOA, possibly New START, as you mentioned, which expires in February next year, which will be barely a month after either the current president takes up his duties for a second term, or a new president in the US will be elected. We also have not only the arms control agreements, but we also have a deterioration of the political situation due to the invasion of Crimea some years ago, or the conflict in Ukraine and Donbass. Russia is no longer a member of the G8 club. We have rising tensions in the Middle East, which we're witnessing on a constant basis. And we have the deployment of nuclear weapons and the hefty increases in military hardware technology, including nuclear technology. And that means that we have an increasing danger also of the possibility of cyber attacks, also new technology as it becomes developed. And what were once givens regarding alliance structures and multilateral systems are really no longer valid. They don't hold anymore. When you look at the last 20 years, you can see that global military expenditure grew by 75%. 25 years, 75%. And it now stands at 1.8 trillion, and that's an increase of 2.6% since 2017. But of course, 2.6% of 1.8 trillion is an awful lot of money. And the top 5 military spenders are, of course, USA, China, Saudi Arabia, India, and France. And in the 2021 US budget, which was just released earlier this month, it was revealed that the US intends to create a new submarine-launched nuclear warhead, which they named W93. And its development is part of a 19% increase this year to $19.8 billion for the National Nuclear Security Administration. And that's a jump of more than 50% since 2017. In 3 years, 50%. And that was Trump's first year in office, if you recall. And also included in this budget that was released, $28.9 billion for the Pentagon to modernize nuclear delivery systems. And when you look at the risk matrices that are developed, for example, by the World Economic Forum, they show the top risk as weapons of mass destruction for several years in a row already. And in 2020, they changed the format slightly and didn't have the ranking anymore, but where weapons of mass destruction remain the top geopolitical risk, long-term risk in terms of impact. The other development in January, you always have the release of the so-called doomsday clock, and that was moved 20 seconds closer to world apocalypse. And now it stands at 100 seconds to midnight. And as we know, every US president since John F. Kennedy has concluded treaties with the Soviet Union or with Russia. And more than a dozen treaties limiting nuclear testing, nuclear weapons, activities in outer space, and missile defense have been part of this mix. It's not been perfect, but what has happened is that it's enabled the Russia and US to manage their strategic competition without going to war. And the turn away from these arms control agreements is really not happening in a vacuum. The National Nuclear Security Administration, which I mentioned earlier, which is part of the US Department of Energy that oversees weapons production, announced that it has begun production of a new low-yield nuclear weapon that is about 1/3 as powerful as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And they are called, quote, small enough to use and could be ready for deployment within months. We also must remember that there was a nuclear posture review in 2018, and the definition of extreme circumstances, which broadens contingencies in which the US would use nuclear weapons, such as, and I quote, non-nuclear strategic attacks, unquote, or a nuclear strike against a group that, quote, supports or enables terrorist efforts to obtain or employ nuclear devices, unquote. It would also consider use of nuclear weapons in case of, quote, non-nuclear strategic attacks on US, allied or partner civilian population or infrastructure. So this is a very dangerous expansion of the definition in which the United States would use nuclear weapons. And in response to this, of course, there is a response by Russia. And this Russia, President Putin unveiled the development of new nuclear weapons and a new hypersonic missile, Kinzhal, a range of 2,000 kilometers, and the Avangard with a range of 6,000 kilometers in March 2018. And after the abrogation of the JCPOA and the INF, the New START is really the only arms control treaty remaining, as I mentioned. Now, Russia has made a proposal to the United States in late 2019 to prolong New START without any preconditions for 5 years. That was done by Deputy Prime Minister Ryabkov. There's been no response that I'm aware of, but on the other hand, a few days ago, the press reported that the US administration would like to name a high-level negotiator to oversee nuclear talks with Moscow and also possibly with China, which of course has never been involved in any arms control agreements. Now, where does it really leave Europe? And that's the question that we're addressing here. The EU published its global strategy in 2016, stressing that the world was increasingly complex and that power was diffused. Rules were always seen as a guarantor of behavior, but this was really changed with the election of Donald Trump, who upended the apple cart because he based US policy on a very aggressive military posture. The INF Treaty, which eliminated the entire class of weapons, of course, was abrogated by the US, no consultation with the allies, and coupled with the end of the ABM and EFE treaties, Europe is again experiencing a return to the unpredictability, or what I would call Cold War relations with Russia, as previous cooperative efforts have been buried. And also, the abrogation of the JCPOA left primarily the Europeans in search of a mechanism to convince the Iranians to abide by the treaty, a situation that is still evolving with Iran's decision to ignore the limits of the JCPOA enrichment, while the arrangements to provide robust trade in stacks are so far disappointing. And I heard the latest efforts were now to import humanitarian goods and medication in view of the coronavirus outbreak. This was reported just 2 or 3 days ago. Now, to me, there are 3 fundamental priority actions for the EU. The EU can step up diplomatic efforts where others rely only on the law of the jungle. They can also step in where the US cannot or will not uphold multilateral commitments anymore. And they can continue to speak out in favor of disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. There are a couple of recommendations that I have, and I think it's a little bit presumptuous of my part to sort of say these are recommendations that the EU could do, but on the other hand, I think that they have been made in other cases, and I will cite a couple of them. I think the first part is to start a dialogue with Russia, particularly as they were against the unilateral abrogation of the INF. Also, we should consider the implications of a breakdown of the INF. How will it affect Europe? What will actually happen? What are the scenarios that we can foresee? Are there any scenarios that anyone has thought about? Also, the Europeans should signal to the US that responses must be consulted within the NATO alliance. Clearly, this has not happened because the deployment of new nuclear capabilities should only happen on the basis of collective NATO decisions. And let's not forget that, of course, Europe is not all NATO. It also includes states like Austria, where we are, which certainly do not belong to a military alliance. The insistence on by the US on fair burden sharing must be reciprocated by collective decision-making, not unilateral decision-making. We also should think about the 5 NATO countries that host nuclear weapons facilities, and also of the fact that existing nuclear-capable NATO aircraft need to be replaced by 2024. And I think you've seen already that there have been an actual outcry about the Trident decision in the UK that was taken just a couple of days, that became public, I should say, became public just a couple of days ago. There's also a broader dialogue on strategic stability that is needed. Belgium and Germany are members of the UN Security Council, in addition to, of course, France, UK, not. But on the other hand, they could be holding a discussion in the Security Council, and actually it is happening, I think, tomorrow, that there will be a meeting convened in the Security Council on the outcome of the NPT. Now, already it's a bit disappointing because the Germans who had insisted on this meeting being held, and the German foreign minister is there in New York right now, they wanted to have a presidential statement, which is one of the measures by which the Security Council can express an opinion. But I understand that there's no appetite for this, so in essence there will only be like a press statement made later on to the press, which is the lowest outcome of a Security Council meeting. I will basically limit myself to this and come back to some more points in the discussion when we start it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to proceed with HEINZ GÄRTNER, who is a member of advisory board at the IAP and also professor and lecturer at the University of Vienna. HEINZ, what is your take on the upcoming NPT conference?
Thank you, Marylia. Thank you for chairing this. In general, my take is that arms control is in crisis. Arms control, as we know it from the time during the Cold War and afterwards, and the INF is a case in point. So I will focus on 3, let's say 4 issues, and all the 4 issues might be or will be part and will be topics of the NPT review conference in April and May, and some of them Angela already mentioned as well. So one will be the INF, the second will be the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the third, the JCPOA, and the fourth, a little bit touch upon the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. So those who heard me already this morning, because we had the workshop, I repeat myself, I apologize for that, who might be bored now. First, INF, and as you know, so the INF Treaty, the Treaty on the prohibition of the medium-range territorial-based ballistic missiles has been suspended last year and subsequently abandoned by the US and Russia as well. So how did we get there? In the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s, we had this deterrence concept, the mutually assured destruction. That means the idea, I want to inflict maximum damage on the adversary, but every side wanted to reserve its second strike capabilities. So in the consequence, that would mean mutual self-destruction. So both nuclear superpowers at that time developed a new idea and said, okay, that's not good for us, self-destruction, so what can we do? So we develop smaller nuclear weapons, and they can be limited on a certain theater without escalating to the intercontinental level, leaving out two superpowers. So NATO developed at that time this concept of flexible response. That means we react to a conventional attack by Warsaw Pact countries with nuclear weapons and going up the escalation ladder, and maybe the other side would be blink and withdraw. That would be the idea. But then the consequence was that Russia, the Soviet Union, and the US were about to deploy these medium-range missiles, the SS-20 on Eastern Europe, and the Persian 2 and cruise missiles in Western Europe. So now the Europeans found out that's a danger for us, because now we could become the nuclear theater. So the nuclear powers might exchange a nuclear war on European theater without leaving that out, without escalating to the intercontinental strategic level. So not only the government found out about it, we had a huge peace movement at the beginning of the 80s. Then we had the INF Treaty in 1987 between Gorbachev and Reagan, and basically that was the only arms control treaty which destroyed a whole category of weapons, the medium-range nuclear missiles. So now we are back to square one. So the treaty has been abandoned, and now we have a possibility again that this medium-range missiles will be, and they are about actually to be deployed on European soil, but not only on European soil, also in Asia. And a nuclear exchange could be limited to Asian or European theater. And both sides, Russia and the US, are developing, and Angela was mentioning it, small yield nuclear weapons, which basically are warfighting weapons and not deterrence weapons anymore. So it's easier to use them, and with a hope that they will not escalate to a higher level. So the reason why this treaty was abandoned was not what we hear from both sides. So there was a blame game going on, so that each side would violate the treaty. So both sides went to the edge of violation. So that was not the reason. The reason was, first of all, China, because China was not part of the treaty, and China's missiles 80% based on medium-range, the medium-range category. And the second, of course, is technology, because now we have smaller weapons which can be deployed, and so both sides didn't want to be limited to deploy these weapons. So we have the same situation, even more dangerous than we had in the 80s. So I'm still surprised why we don't have a peace movement now. So the situation is even more dangerous than then. So that's a big surprise. So, and Angela mentioned that has something to do also with the new START Treaty. Angela mentioned it. So both sides always want to keep the escalation dominance, that if it escalates to a higher level, they always want to be the one who has a second strike and also the last strike. So, and to keep this escalation dominance on the top level means I have to have the strategic nuclear weapons to be the last one to strike. And the START Treaty is a limitation. So START Treaty is a limitation, and that's why my guess is that the START Treaty will not be extended, continued, and also President Trump doesn't like treaties which have been negotiated by President Obama. That's an additional reason. So the second issue I want to talk about is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, where Austria was one of the major sponsors, and we have one, Thomas Heinertzi, sitting here, one of the major proponents of this treaty as an official. So as you probably know, 2017, 122 states voted in New York in a UN Assembly for this treaty. No nuclear weapon states was amongst them, and no state which is allied with a nuclear weapon state, neither. That means no NATO state voted for it. Right now, I guess we have 35 ratifications, and the treaty will enter into force if we have 50 ratifications. So the treaty consists of three main pillars. It calls for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Second, it warns of the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. And in spite of its critics, it calls for the full implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's lots of debate that the PAN Treaty, the so-called PAN Treaty, would undermine the NPT. The contrary is the case, because if you read the treaty, it's mentioned several times that the treaty intends to fully implement the NPT treaty. So the biggest achievement of this treaty was that it created a new norm system. So the nuclear weapon states and NATO states would not join the treaty in the time to come. So in the near future, so the treaty might enter into force, but those states will stay out for a long time to come. But what the treaty does, it created a new legal norm in contrast to the deterrence norm. So the idea of the treaty is that the world is more secure without nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states always would argue the world is more secure with nuclear weapons because we have to rely on deterrence. The proponents of the treaty would say also the population and the nuclear weapon states would be more secure without nuclear weapons, because they are the first target in a nuclear weapons exchange. So why is this treaty, was this treaty necessary? Because the non-nuclear weapon states feel betrayed somehow, because they abandoned their idea of having nuclear weapons with the NPT, but the nuclear weapon states did not meet their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT, which calls to negotiate in good faith for complete disarmament. There was some disarmament, at the same time there was modernization. So the idea was they sacrificed something without getting something in return. So in order to close this gap, what the NPT calls for and what was the result, the treaty would fill this so-called legal gap to implement the requirements of Article 6 of the NPT. So nuclear weapon states would say the PAN Treaty would create a polarization between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. The truth is that the polarization was here before, so between the haves and the have-nots. So the treaty is just an implementation and complement to the NPT. So there are some ideas how it can be implemented. There are some more radical ideas, and other ideas would be step by step, so we're not going to discuss it right now. We can do it in the Q&A. So that's the third issue, where also Austria should have a vested interest that it would be kept alive. There's a GCPOA, and it was negotiated here in the final phase in Vienna, which was a success of the Austrian diplomacy. I myself almost every day went to this Coburg where it has been negotiated, and to get some information out in bits and pieces. It was so sometimes Foreign Minister Zarif or Foreign Minister Kerry came out and told us about the progress, very general, but what we got, the journalists there and some academics, what the impression what we got is that every full stop and comma has been negotiated and agreed upon. So it is the best negotiated arms control agreement in history. So in contrast, what President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu are saying, and it does not expire, so it doesn't have an expiration date. So there are some provisions which expire over some time, from 15 to 40, 35 years, but these provisions easily can be extended. Any arms control agreement has an expiration date, like the START Treaty, that can be extended. But the treaty as such is permanent. So if you read the preamble, Iran declares that it never would acquire nuclear weapons. And this agreement is enshrined in a UN Security Council Resolution 2231. That means that this agreement is based on international law, and the withdrawal of the out of the agreement, like President Trump did, is a violation of international law. There have been many hopes linked to this agreement. 3 minutes, thank you. And there have been many hopes linked to this. Iranians, of course, hoped for economic investment, more trade. For the European Union, it was a masterpiece of effective multilateralism, and also Europeans hoped to get better investment in Iran. And for President Obama, it was an example of his engagement policy. All this has been stopped by President Trump in 2018, and with his withdrawal violation of the agreement, all these incidents started, what we have here. So it was, before that it was fine, it was calm more or less in the Persian Gulf region. Since then we have all these incidents, and there's a blame game going on, who did what. So the peak was the assassination of the General Soleimani. What the European Union did was, now, I think it was a very dangerous game, to trigger this dispute settlement mechanism, which means basically the idea is that, I guess it was the pressure of the US to do this, that after 65 days, there is no agreement in the Joint Commission and Foreign Ministers, and it would go to the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council would impose all the other sanctions, UN sanctions on Iran as well. Iran threatened to leave the NPT afterwards, and the Europeans, with triggering this mechanism, would leave the leverage about the decision whether to keep the JCPOA alive or not to the US. High Representative Borrell thought that was really dangerous, so he said, okay, we have this mechanism, but we extend the deadline indefinitely, that we have some more time to negotiate. So the final point, 1 minute, thank you, Maria. One solution, of course, is the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. So the JCPOA is the core, could be the core of the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. All the provisions are there. We know it was topic of several NPT review conferences. It failed because of the opposition of the US, but of course because of Israel. But there are other possibilities to come close to this nuclear weapon-free zone, and that's what maybe not discussed that much in the various in the UN and in the working groups. and also in the participating states. So what Iran could do, Iran and the Arab states also want to have this nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. And Iran could basically join the nuclear weapon-free zone Semipalatinsk in the north. If it gets negative security assurances by the US, that means no, the nuclear weapon states does not threaten states in the zone with nuclear weapons. And the Arab states could join the Benel Treaty in the south. So we would have a huge nuclear weapon-free belt from Mongolia with a little stretch, and Kazakhstan, Central Asia to Africa. Egypt already signed the Berlin-Dawa Treaty, didn't ratify it. What is left out is Israel, but it would be huge pressure on Israel to discuss the rationale of its nuclear weapons. So final sentence, what I think is we have a very dangerous escalation here now because of the end of the traditional arms control agreement. So the INF, the JCPOA is in danger, START as well. But the PAN Treaty created a new norm system which gives us some hope that the deterrence is not the only norm system anymore, but also a disarmament. Sorry.
Thank you very much for this elaborate discussion of everything that's more or less will be going on at the next NPT review conference. I would like now to turn to RAMSES WESSEL, who is a professor and head of European Law Department at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. So RAMSES, I would like to ask you more about, of course, the European perspective and the European standing, but also on the internal European mechanisms of how arms control is dealt with. So we know that we have this common foreign security policy, which is something as foreign policy of the European Union, but then again, we hear a lot about sovereignty debate and how every member state wants to regulate their foreign policy on their own. And then sometimes these competences of the EU and member states are overlapping, and then it's very confusing for non-Europeans to understand who is responsible for what. So can you please maybe shed some light on that?
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you very much, Maria. It's not only complex for third states, it's also complex for us to understand where the division line of competences lies between the EU and its member states. One of the key questions, Europe came up a couple of times during the previous speeches, so Europe should stand up. They should do something at a certain moment. And the first question that a legal scholar would ask is actually, can they actually do that? If I ask my students, name any of the international arms control organizations, they would not really list the European Union on top of that list. Because we know the European Union as a different type of organization that was created for many other things. And arms control, at the moment, international arms control at least, has come up only with the creation of CFSP, indeed. So the question, can they do that, and are they allowed to do that, and should they actually be engaged in all these discussions as a European Union? The answer is yes. And the very easy reason for that is, and the very clear reason for that is, that the European Union has set itself the task not just to look at its own member state, but to act in the world as a normative actor. So if you look at the treaty, the current one, it is full of all kinds of references to the European Union wanting to have a better international security and wanting to play a role in that area. So that is very clear. There is a task for the European Union to be done. Then again, it was also mentioned, it is most of it, what it is doing, it's based on common foreign and security policy. And we know that common foreign and security policy is not the easiest system to take decisions with. It's based on unanimous voting, or not voting at all. You need to have a consensus at least at the end. So each and every decision can be blocked by each and every member of the Council. At the same time, we have seen that the European Union has become one of the most active international organizations in non-proliferation issues and arms control. It's not just military missions, for instance, which have increasingly being used also in particular in Africa, for instance, to fight the spread of arms, the proliferation of small arms. Obviously, the arms embargoes are very well known, initiated by the European Union. But perhaps most of all, it's the positions that the European Union attempts to take at international conferences and international organizations. And it's in particular those positions that are very important. And so we're always focusing on, did the European Union succeed in formulating one coherent EU policy through which it can convince other states? And HEINZ also already referred, we had a conference today in this very room, and we also discussed those issues, and it's of course not completely clear what the advantage always is of a coherent EU foreign policy. There may be pros and cons of an EU foreign policy, just reflecting the discussion that we had today. The fact is that there is a strive for having that, and we have also seen in the 2015 NPT conference that it was not so easy to reach one, and we may hear more about the upcoming one, where it might also not be so easy to reach a common position. So what instruments does the EU have? What have they been active in? Of course, non-proliferation policies, I think, is the most well-known, where the European Union has really been very, very active in producing a lot of positions, a lot of views, a lot of papers in that area, which have at least, you could say, influenced the discussion. They may have not reached to the result that they had intended, but there has certainly been some influence if you look at the studies that looked back, for instance, at NPT 2015. I think one of the more perhaps even interesting thing is the export control policies. What the European Union has initiated, at least in Europe, in terms of export control of its own member states, has set an example for the rest of the world. It has set an example for during negotiations on the Arms Trade Treaty, where some of the best practices have been adopted internationally at the global level. At the same time, if you really look at this, our export control mechanism, where member states of the European Union have to follow strict rules before they export certain goods, and especially, of course, the dual-use commodities, which can be used for different purposes. There's still some flexibility. And at the same time, member states do have this flexibility, but at the same time, they seem to be in agreement on what is necessary to be dealing with. The other one, indeed, I mentioned it briefly, is arms embargoes. So what do we see with arms embargoes? In contrast to other economic sanctions, arms embargoes can be based on CFSP-only decisions, which means that they only need, in legal terms, a legal basis in the CFSP part of the treaty. That makes it easier on the one hand, because you don't need to have follow-up discussions and follow-up regulations in that sense. At the same time, what we see happening over the past few years is that the Union tries to combine that. So it's no longer just an arms embargo, but we have seen examples where arms embargoes are combined with, for instance, visa bans or with the freezing of funds. So economic sanctions and arms embargoes as a sort of comprehensive package. And that, in a way, I think could also be a way forward for the European Union. You see that it is increasingly trying to combine different policy areas to make things work and not completely isolate the foreign policy, the CFSP measures, from anything else. And the Lisbon Treaty, the current EU treaty, makes it easier to do that than before. One other example of that is the non-proliferation clauses that we see in trade agreements. So we have all these agreements concluded between the European Union and other states, which include this standard clause on non-proliferation. So both parties agree that they will work towards efforts in the area of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. A very interesting element. The European Union has a lot of experience, of course, in that area with human rights clauses in for instance, trade agreements. And we see the similar thing with these non-proliferation treaties. We had an interesting discussion today during the workshop on whether that is actually an effective instrument. They have never been invoked. And there's no case where somebody said, okay, you're violating the non-proliferation clause, so I'm stopping my trade relationship with you. But is that a good sign or is that a bad sign? Well, that is open for discussion, at least. Finally, in conclusion, perhaps, where do we stand at the moment? I think the fact that everything that the European Union does, almost everything that it does, is based on CFSP, based on common foreign and security policy, also defines the possibilities and the impossibilities. We are stuck with the rules to decide with all the member states at the table. You cannot use majority voting to overrule any other states, which has worked very well in other areas of the European Union, of course. So that sort of limits the possibilities. At least that limits the possibilities to adopt legally binding instruments. And again, today we had an interesting discussion on whether that is the most important thing to adopt, because the European Union is adopting a lot of other instruments that may have even more impact on the discussion globally than the legal instruments that it is supposed to take under the basis of the treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to Clara Portela, who is a Senior Associate Analyst at the European Institute for Security Studies. We've heard a lot already about the European member states and how different their positions are. There are some states who are advocating against nuclear weapons at all. There are some who are actually possessing them. Only one remaining in the EU. And then there are NATO members also who are under this American nuclear umbrella. But they all come to the NPT conference, review conference, and they're trying to negotiate some joint statements and common positions. How does it work? Does it work at all?
Thank you very much, Maria. So basically, this was exactly going to be the topic of my presentation, even though there has already been some mention, well, quite a lot of mention about the role of the EU, but I think I'm going to follow on the theme that was proposed by HEINZ GÄRTNER about back to square one. Are we back to square one? Okay, perhaps I should approach the mic a bit more. Okay, so basically the EU had already started before the creation of the CFSP with a practice. Oh, now, I think that now this is too high. Can you hear me well, or perhaps too well? Okay, okay. So already before the creation of the CFSP, after the Treaty of Maastricht, the EU had started the practice of agreeing common catalogs of measures that it would take into the NPT review conferences. So already in the year 1995, the EU had put together a catalogue of measures that it reflected in a legally binding CFSP common position. And this practice continued in following sessions. And actually we can see an upward trend in the sense that every year this catalogue became longer and also more substantive. So this is a purely quantitative measure, but still it tells us something about how this pre-review conference coordination was becoming stronger. Well, the thing is that by the year 2015, we actually witnessed a setback. There was no catalogue agreed. Instead, there were just a couple of vague references made in Council conclusions. And, well, the question is whether we are going to witness a similar situation in the upcoming NPT conference. And actually, the guess is that this is actually quite likely. We might not see any CFSP act with anything like a common catalogue of measures reflecting the common agreement among the member states, which is not necessarily a negative thing, but it definitely stands in contrast, first of all, with the fact that at a time where there is a decline in the general arms control landscape, we actually have less unity within internally within the context of the Council. And interestingly, we have also seen how the EU over recent years have become better at managing non-proliferation crisis, as was mostly illustrated by the Iran deal, as HEINZ GÄRTNER also highlighted. And it was also interesting to see how the EU had started to take a more coercive approach to non-proliferation and disarmament than we had witnessed in the early days of the development of a role in the arms control field in the context of the CFSP. So in any case, how can the EU make a useful contribution to the upcoming NPT review conference? We have to take into account that the main aim, the stated aim of the EU with regard to the NPT review conference is obviously the preservation of the NPT framework and also the promotion of a successful outcome of the conference altogether. So in order to achieve this, first of all, one should keep fully maintain the practice of searching for consensus, which is a systematic practice that has already been in place for quite a while, and there's no reason why this should stop. On the contrary, there is good reason to actually continue with this search for consensus, because this is the only way in which points of agreement can be identified at all. But when it comes to presenting statements and working papers and basically supporting initiatives, here the EU could adopt perhaps a more selective approach and only present those working papers or, only submit those working papers or make common statements in those cases in which it has original proposals that will contribute something new to the NPT framework and that really have an added value for the general discussion. Otherwise, it can simply restrict its role to supporting groupings which represent the middle ground within the context of the NPT. And secondly, another step that it can take in order to recover at least some degree of internal consensus is to reconcile itself with the ban treaty, or at least relax its opposition to the ban treaty. The idea here is that the EU can contribute to create a discourse that highlights the compatibility between the ban treaty and the NPT, rather than framing the ban treaty as a threat to the NPT. So here, basically the work to be done is simply to create a discourse that promotes a more consensual approach without necessarily representing an obligation for anybody to join the treaty or even to observe the treaty. So, thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you very much. So I've heard quite a lot of opportunities for the European Union throughout all these talks. It was mentioned that the European Union can create this new discourse within the NPT on the compatibility of the ban treaty with the NPT. Then there was also a lot of examples of how the EU regulates arms control through its trade policies, through arms embargoes and sanctions. So there are plenty of stuff that can be done still. Angela also mentioned stepping up diplomatic efforts, which is in times of declining multilateralism probably the biggest value of the European Union, since it still can prove that it works in this area. What was also mentioned was the Middle East nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction free zone. And I would like also to ask an additional question maybe to any of the panelists who would like to tackle it, but also maybe starting with Angela. There was this conference held in New York in November last year that was particularly dealing with the Middle East weapons free zone, but it was done outside the NPT process. The question would be how do you assess it, whether it's a contribution to the overall effort or what outcome was there?
Well, I think having been responsible as former High Representative at the time for the so-called Glion process as it was a very intensive period of about 3 years where we met very, very regularly in order to get this conference going. And as you know, there was a Finnish ambassador who was basically heading it. The conference was agreed in 2010 that it would be held in 2012. Very unfortunate timing, actually, because in November 2012 there were elections in the United States. So I think that really doomed that date from day one. I don't understand why it was ever chosen, but we were stuck with it. And that ended 2012. The conference did not take place. There were a number of meetings. They were very slow, I would say, but they were meetings. And every time you have meetings, you make a little bit of progress. In the end, I think the League of Arab States members pretty much gave up on the process because they felt that there wasn't enough momentum that was being created, and already within the year before the 2015 conference, it was very clear that this was not going to be held, the conference was not going to take place, and in the end that was usually attributed to the lack of the consensus document for the 2015 NPT review conference, which of course, that was basically opposed by the US, UK, and by Canada. They spoke out against it, so we didn't have a conference. So then what happened was that, I don't want to talk about the humanitarian consequences and then what happened because the TPNW is a different issue, but the Arab states basically decided that they did not want to have this matter brought into the NPT process again, even though they felt that they had gotten not a concession, but they had actually given concessions, and they didn't get anything in return because that promise by the guarantor states, meaning US, UK, and Russia, was not fulfilled. They decided that they would have a General Assembly process, so the conference did take place last year, and it is going to be an annual conference, so basically it will be held, and I think it reminds me a little bit of the TPNW process, where the main parties that are really affected by a possible outcome are not there at the table, and by that I mean Israel. Let me come back to the European Union, because what I think is very positive about the European Union is that the European Union was instrumental at that time already to give some funding for what we call now the Glion process, and also the European Union took a decision to fund a 3-year process of about close to $3 million. I think it's $2.87 million, a 3-year process. They gave that money to UNIDIR, a research institute, a UN research institute, to basically study what went wrong in that first process, the so-called Glion process, and also to see whether a 1.5 track meetings and process could be instituted. That project started fairly recently. I don't have any results on it. I can't really tell you. Under my chairmanship, we still did a lessons learned also of the Glion process, and I'm sure that's going to be even further outlined and further worked on. But again, let me underline that I think it's very positive that the EU did actually make that proposal, made the money available in order to assist the whole process and to detoxify, if I can call it, the atmosphere around that issue.
Thank you very much. You want to add?
Yeah, because of the nuclear weapon-free zone, what you ask. Of course, if you go look at the nuclear weapon-free zone, Middle East, Israel was always a stumbling block. So creating a nuclear weapon-free zone and include Israel in the first place is a no-go. So you can create, that was my idea, nuclear weapon-free zones in the first place without Israel, around Israel. So we have in the north and the south the possibility, which would put pressure on Israel. Secondly, we have these negative security assurances. That means the promise by nuclear weapon states not to threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. We have several declaratory statements on this also in the documents of the NPT review conferences, but they should be put on a legal basis. And the consequence, if you put the negative security assurances on a legal basis, is that the nuclear weapon states have to sign and ratify the protocols of the nuclear weapon-free zones in the world. So the protocols are legally binding. In the protocols you find the negative security assurances, and then the nuclear weapon states would have to commit themselves not to legally not to use, threaten to use nuclear weapons against the members of those states. And that would be an incentive, of course, of those states who are not members of the nuclear weapon-free zones, Semipalatinsk or Belindabayet, and who did not ratify it, to do it, if they get these negative security assurances in return. And these negative security assurances are the only commitment by nuclear weapons states towards the nuclear weapon-free zones. All the other commitments are with the non-nuclear weapon states. So they are the negative security assurances, but they should be put on a legal basis.
Any other comments? Then maybe we will open the floor for questions from the audience. Raise your hand, please, and identify yourself and pose a question.
Questions or answers?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you very much. I tried to break the ice. I want to commend the very eloquent discussions and explanations. I have many points, but I try to shrink it because of the time. One point in this intellectual gathering is, please have a look on the last decades on the notion of arms control and disarmament. In fact, we are paying the heavy price for not intellectuals paying attention to the fact that nuclear arms control has legitimated already the nuclear weapons. And the reason that we are facing this unfortunate situation is that we trusted two superpowers to do the arms control. The notion itself was a mistake. It means that they have legitimized the nuclear weapon, they just said we'll control it. Therefore, this notion, I have a serious problem with this. Having, let's say, 34 years or so experience, I think that we should review this notion. We should emphasize disarmament. And we have lost a lot of opportunities. Non-nuclear weapon states, civil societies have been derailed from that attention. Whenever there was a negotiation between two superpowers, they applauded. They shouldn't apply it because there is no international verification, and we know what's the situation. Anytime one of them might withdraw, as it happens, and very eloquently explain. Therefore, this is food for thought. The next point is about the NPT. Why we feel shame, and we will not openly say, of course it was touched upon today, that NPT is the most discriminative treaty in disarmament and non-proliferation. Haves and have not, and for 50 years there's no change. And it has been total failure. The number of nuclear weapons, the capability and qualification of nuclear weapons have increased compared to the last 50 years before NPT. An important point is, of course, the Article 6. In 2010, which I was one of the friends of President of NPT, they proposed, and it was fortunately become a position of non-aligned movement, that by 2025, the weapon states, 5 weapon states of NPT should commit themselves to eliminate nuclear weapons. And this was a success, but of course, because of consensus, this was not done. Therefore, the lack of any timeline in Article 6 is a serious problem. And this had to be settled down. I've given a paper, of course, I've discussed in many occasions. Unfortunately, I heard just right now the conference in Pogwash in Doha, which I was on the way on Saturday, is canceled now. I have given a paper. I'm delighted to give that paper to you after this meeting. And I have a nuclear option proposal to survive NPT. And that is it, amendment conference for Article 6 of NPT, or if they do not accept it, all non-nuclear weapon states should collectively threaten the weapon states that if you will not accept to start negotiation by certain date, maybe 2022, then all we will withdraw from NPT. Because what is the use of NPT when there is no, after 50 years, there's not. There is the time that the business should not be as usual. And 22-20 is a challenging conference, not only ban treaty. And of course, I have other things, but I have to commend Austria and also Ireland and others for their very serious position on ban treaty, because this is giving a serious signal to the weapon states that they cannot tolerate this situation as it is. Of course, I appreciate the other points. I will refrain from taking your time, but maybe at the break time I will say some points and comments. And thank you very much, and congratulations for the organizers.
Thank you. Are there any other? There is a question here and there.
I'm Karin Burmester. I'm a former senior staff member of the IAEA. I partly agree, of course, with my successor, and I see also that the NPT is on one side or really an agreement of discrimination. I fully agree with your statement there. But on the other side, I see it as the most important agreement which is existing. And I think really the number of the countries of nuclear weapons countries is really limited with regard to this treaty. If we would never had this treaty, I think the number were going up completely. But I think in 1995, when the treaty was extended, unlimited extended, the whole society or the majority of the society of the world was really happy, and it was a big celebration that we were reaching this agreement. But of course, if we are looking to the status of today, and also with regard to the Article 6, I fully agree with you, then I think I would say also, Mr. Gärtner, would you agree that with this regard, the unlimited extension was a mistake? So it means that we lost the power. We lost the power to pressure the weapon states really also to do something on disarmament. And there we lost our most important instrument, the 5 years extension process. Of course, 5 years after, the additional agreement was adopted. That I think was also a big step forward. But afterwards, I see if we are looking to the last review conferences, there were not really any important results achieved. So, yeah, what's your opinion, therefore? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question in the second row, please, here.
Well, thank you. My name is Fred Tanner. I'm from the OSCE. I don't talk on behalf of the OSCE here, just as a private person. But I think some experience I have could be perhaps briefly be brought up here too in this discussion, because I think we have seen that we are, first many thanks to IPP to organize that. And I'm also glad to see that the EU actually deals with arms control and disarmament, which is very important. But I think the point I'd like to make is that we should not just look at weapons and increasing military budgets, which I think have been very nicely described by Angela Kane, but also another point which Angela made, which is that we should also look at the broader picture of tensions and threats. I mean, the reality is, and this is a bit the elephant in the room this evening, that of course we have the P5, and they don't budge, they don't move. I don't think we can try as much as we can to organize, let's say, to make proposals for nuclear weapon-free zones. If the P5 don't buy into it, it's very difficult. They do in some, and I think that's why I like Professor Gärtner's proposals. But my point is also with regard to EU, of course you have France, nuclear France. And how do you walk the thin line from an NPT with regard to making constructive proposals? You even mentioned the nuclear ban, which I think is a complete taboo, I suppose, in the French discourse. So how do you approach that? And so linked to that is, of course, you have quite a few countries which are trying to bridge this gap between the P5 and let's say, those have-nots which Ambassador Soltanier has referred to. I think we had recently this Stockholm initiative, which I just discovered, which builds on the 13 steps, but now it's called Building Stepping Stones. And that brings me back to the OSCE very briefly, because what they propose is to create a conducive environment where dialogue is easier with the nuclear weapon states, particularly in the field of risk reduction, incident prevention, and also in structured dialogue, as been referred to before as well. And this is actually what the OSCE is doing. We have structured dialogue. We try to work on risk reductions, and we work on incident prevention. Of course, in the nuclear field it's different. I think we would have to talk about de-targeting nuclear, about de-alerting, about increasing the time span of decision-making. I think Angela Kane also referred to supersonic missiles. I mean, how can we overcome all these arms race developments which make the world even more dangerous? And I think here, of course, I think, again, my proposal is to look a bit beyond the nuclear arms issues, INF, New START, etc., and look at the kind of meta situation And again, I can just recommend to look at the Stockholm Initiative. Actually, I'm surprised that Austria is not part of it. Perhaps we can hear about that. I think these are primarily states which actually are trying to be in between. Even so, Sweden is part of it too, of course, and Sweden has signed the test ban, the nuclear ban treaty. So just to Sweden? Really sure? Okay. Well, I know that. I know that. Okay, I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, would you like to comment on the...
Well, if you want, I can go a little bit further into those things. First of all, I think it's very important that the NPT is a deal between the non-nuclear weapon states that they wouldn't acquire nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, the nuclear weapon states took a legal obligation to achieve nuclear disarmament. And that is totally right. Arms control and nuclear disarmament is not the same thing. So that was, when you look into the history of the treaty, I mean, these Irish proposals first and so on, that was always very clear. And on one hand, we have seen that the number of nuclear armed states has risen, but none of those, of course, that were states parties of the NPT, with the notable exception of North Korea, but they quit the treaty, and so that's a problem. I don't want to go into details here. But as has been said before, it could have been much worse. We could have today 30 nuclear weapon states. I mean, the technology is not so difficult anymore. So the knowledge is more or less in the scientific domain. So in that respect, I think even so we have now more nuclear armed states over 50 years, it's a success. On the nuclear disarmament side, I think we have to be fair also to the 5 official nuclear weapon states. We have seen very substantial reductions, especially in the 90s and then even beginning of the new millennium. The problem is it was on a, perhaps not too fast, but still on a good path. Today, as Angela has very clearly said, we rather see a development into the wrong direction. New nuclear weapons, it's very hard to fulfill your obligation of nuclear disarmament. You continue to build new ones that are perhaps more sophisticated, more deadly, and so on. The numbers are not falling anymore in a very substantial way. So that's the problem of the treaty, that one camp is not fulfilling their legal obligation. And it's so important for us to always mention that the NPT is a major treaty, because it's the only one in which the nuclear weapon states have taken the obligation to fulfill Article 6, nuclear disarmament. Then going on to a problem that wasn't mentioned, and it's always a pleasure to add more problems, is the third pillar, which is the peaceful use. Everybody agrees that peaceful use is very good.
Can you speak in the microphone?
Think of medicine, agriculture, and so on, but not everyone agrees on nuclear power stations. And we see, especially now with global warming and so on, that industry and some states want to sell now nuclear power generation as the green energy form, good for the environment. Austria is not at all isolated in the EU, that we think it's not sustainable, and we would never accept such formulations, of course. So there's it's not a new problem in the EU, but now it's more accentuated. That doesn't make it easier for the EU. The EU on non-proliferation basically agrees. I think that's the easier part. Of course, on nuclear disarmament, and CLARA has written a very good paper on those issues. The EU cannot pretend to have the same view, because everybody knows that Austria, Ireland, and some others, and France have quite contrary views on this. And then we have, of course, a high number of states in an alliance that doesn't have the nuclear element in its treaty or so on, but in the present strategy. And these states, of course, they will not be ready to go along with formulations that clearly push for nuclear disarmament now. So there we have a fundamental problem for the EU. And the EU, of course, cannot play a kind of middle ground, because the middle ground is somewhere else. The middle ground are the moderate non-aligned countries. We all know about 110 countries are in a nuclear weapon-free zone, so that's already the majority. We know where the majorities are. You mentioned, HEINZ, how many states support the TPNW. So there for the EU it's very difficult. And we have some elements that we have in common, like CTBT entry into force, fissile material cutoff treaty, and JCPOA, very importantly. And on these we can build. So that's the situation in the EU. We are working, we are trying to elaborate council conclusions, we are working on this in preparation. The Swedish initiative, I think, was an initiative taken by the then Swedish Minister Wallström, which is understandable in the framework of the domestic political situation. The TPNW has a wide support in Sweden. However, in the government it didn't have enough support, so they had to offer something. We are doing something for nuclear disarmament, and I think it's a clever initiative. So she selected a number of countries. And Austria was not invited, which I don't see there's a problem, because when you look who is there, you have so many umbrella states, countries in nuclear alliances and so on, so you would end up with quite a low denominator, that is clear. Nevertheless, I think it's a positive initiative. What is good is that in the statement they underline that the achievements of the outcome documents of the NPT process, they have to be maintained. And I think that's the big issue that we will face at the review conference, because there are some voices who say that was then, and we have taken this obligation for today. And then, of course, you ruin what you have built over 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a lot of comments. Maybe we will go for the second round. For now, I would like to ask maybe everyone to react to any part of the questions and comments.
Very interesting and substantive comments, for which I thank you. Let me just address, first of all, this kind of discriminatory aspect of the NPT. I think we all agree. 50 years and nothing has happened in terms of Article 6. And when you look at the amendment conference that you suggested, Ambassador Sultani, maybe we should have another one to reconsider the indefinite extension, as Karen Bormister said. I think every time something like this happens, you have to look at the context. And the context is really that after the fall of the wall in the late 80s, early 90s, then basically it was a different world. You had Obama, who was talking in his Prague address, and that basically led to the indefinite extension. What I find very interesting about this is, for example, North Korea, of course, withdrew in 2003, which was after the indefinite extension. And so immediately the argument was put forward that you can't withdraw from a treaty that's just been indefinitely extended. I mean, I think that's hogwash in my opinion, but I'm not a lawyer, so that's just a lay opinion. What I wanted to come back to the European Union, or the European Parliament rather. Carla and I were at a meeting actually last week, and there was a hearing on nuclear issues. And they issued a resolution. I'm not quite sure that the resolution has actually been adopted or released, but it was in a draft form that I saw. And what it is, and I find this very, very interesting, because when you look at all of the commitments that were made in previous RevCons, you know, all of the steps, you know, 2000, 2010, 95, I mean, you go back, I mean, when you have this catalog of actions that were agreed by consensus, and that means including the nuclear weapon states, the EU actually has a paragraph in that resolution asking that this be catalogued and actually be looked at again. Now that's speaking truth to power, and I take my hat off to them, because I don't hear that very often. That doesn't come up. Everyone talks about the US initiative about creating an environment for nuclear disarmament, but it seems to me that every time you mount the horse from the back, because you all are responsible for creating the environment, and we, the nuclear powers, will then basically agree whether or not it is time to actually reduce or even disarm our nuclear weapons. So that is basically what I see a problem. The nuclear power stations, and I'm going to stop with that and leave it up to my colleagues also here, is a very interesting aspect. It's a very interesting aspect simply because of the Saudi Arabia context. Saudi Arabia is planning to, quote, replace oil with nuclear power stations. I mean, not one, not 5, not 10, a number of them. I forget now how many they are. But the fly in the ointment is, and that's where really what I consider the rubber hits the road, is they don't want to take the uranium from a fuel bank, which exists, but they want to enrich it themselves. And that is basically against any agreement that was made. And so that is something that I don't know where it stands now. I know they're pressuring very strongly the United States. I don't know where Trump is going to go with this, because he is very unpredictable in what he does. But I fear the worst, because why would they want to enrich the uranium themselves? It does not seem to make any sense for me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we will go one after another.
Okay.
Yes.
No, thank you. Just one short remark, perhaps just to highlight the perhaps irony that was also mentioned here in the discussion, that the European Union, at the one hand, is very much promoting the NPT in all its sections, and at the same time is unable to do something constructive about the ban treaty. And obviously the reasons are there. It's not just France. It's indeed also the NATO states. But the arguments we have to underline every time again are political arguments. They're not legal arguments, right? So even my own country, I'm embarrassed to say that the Netherlands uses legal arguments to say that they cannot do that because of NATO commitments, which is completely nonsense. So it's a political choice not to do that, and not a legal one.
Thank you. HEINZ, if you have any comments.
Yeah, a couple of points. No, of course, Ali, disarmament and arms control are not the same thing, but of course there's one treaty which is disarmament, that is the INF Treaty, that was disarmament. So all the rest was arms control. So what no?
No, INF is not. No, absolutely, it was arms control. It's arms
control. There is basically that was the only treaty where a whole category of weapons have been disarmed. Okay, that's semantic now. That's semantic. So that the result was disarmament. So, but also we have this conflict between disarmament and non-proliferation, and that goes to the heart of the NPT. It's not a question of timelines and extension. It's a question how you read the NPT. So in the nuclear weapon states, they read the NPT as a confirmation of their status, because their status was confirmed in '69. Those states who have nuclear weapons at that time, so they are not subject to disarmament. So that's how they read it. But of course, they don't look at Article 6, which is not confirmation of their status, which calls for change. So, and we did have a time limit, the NPT. So when the NPT was concluded in 69, 70, it was concluded for 25 years, and everybody thought after 25 years we would have a disarmament. Nobody thought of the review conference of 95 in 70 that it would be extended. Everybody thought in 95 it would be done, so it was not done. So timelines do not help, so they do not help. So it's a question of substance, it is a question of reading, how you read the NPT. So the second point. Fred Danner made a very good point. So it's not only about weapons, and it's not also only about nuclear weapon-free zone. It's about policies. So, and since you're coming from the OSCE and CEC, so I went back to the Helsinki document 75. So when you read all these statements and national security strategies and nuclear posture reviews, so you all have these terms: rival, enemy, opponents, competitors. So if you read the Helsinki document, there is no word of this. No enemy, no rival, no opponent is mentioned. It's only all about cooperative security. It's about security is indivisible. It's about common security. Borders should be changed only by consensus and based on international law. You even had the Decalogue of common values. So it's the best document what the European diplomacy has created after the Second World War. So if you apply this idea to the Middle East as a regional dialogue forum with all these confidence-building measures and include arms control, you even could include this missile issue, what the Americans and the Europeans always wanted, the Iranians talk about the missiles. The Saudis have longer-range missiles already than the Iranians have. So, okay, not only Iran, but all the regional powers should be involved in arms control negotiations, regional arms control negotiations. Iranian foreign minister called for a regional dialogue already, so they would not oppose it. The Americans might be even satisfied to say they talk about also about the missiles. So a regional dialogue on the basis of this Helsinki model would be one possibility. And I would say Austria, Switzerland, Finland, they could help to facilitate such a regional dialogue. Maybe in their capitals, starting this in their capitals, also offer confidential talks behind the scenes, like the Americans did with the Iranians in Oman in 2011. So all this would be a possibility for smaller neutral states to facilitate, like what Finland did for the Middle East weapon-free zone. That's now a new opportunity to do this. And not only, the Middle East is not only about nuclear weapons. So it's about much more, as you said, much more about policies and about influence there.
Thank you. I think there were 2 more questions. 3 more questions. All right, then 4 more questions and we are closing. Where are we done? Okay, so can I just ask lady at the back one question from there? And there was a question already before from you, and I'm sorry, we have to close here. Yes, you. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm from the CTPTO, and my question is very interestingly, since the CTPTO, also the CTPT treaty was also kind of a condition for the indefinite extension of the NPT. I'm very interested that is the one single arms control, and I say arms control, not disarmament treaty, that nobody has mentioned on the panel. And I would like to know why, because from our perspective, we would think this is the treaty that potentially, not only in the EU, but also worldwide, enjoys the most universal support and could be potentially the smallest common denominator for a potential NPT outcome. But none of you mentioned it in all of your addresses, and I would be just curious to know why.
Thank you very much. And the other question was on this side, here.
Peter Diegischer from the Austrian Peace Association. I just wonder, and I'm sorry to introduce the realistic situation. Fortunately, nobody is dying by nuclear weapons at the moment, but a lot of people are dying by conventional weapons. And I would say this is as well an important point, and I was astonished that some of you mentioned the EU is executing a sort of stopping of exporting of weapons, but I think the EU countries, so France, Germany, Britain, are exporting a lot of weapons, and EU has no measure to stop them, as far as I know, and there's no tendency to try to stop disarmament or to introduce disarmament on a real basis.
Thank you. I would maybe like to all of you respond or make a closing statement already to these two questions. Angela, if we can start with you.
Thank you for taking me to task as a member of the GEM, not to mention the CTBTO. I think it's a matter of that one has too much material and so one kind of skips over it. Let me put it this way, since President Trump has threatened to unsign it, if he had unsigned it, I think it would be prominently mentioned here today. Thank you.
Disarmament of weapons in general, not what you were saying.
Maybe someone else will address that.
And also to reassure you that today at the conference we had here, the CTBTO was mentioned, and also in relation, for instance, to environmental effects of testing. But you're absolutely right; we should have mentioned it here as well. On conventional weapons, just one point. Perhaps I fully agree with you that the focus is very much also if you look at the export of arms in the European Union to risky areas, to crisis areas. The focus is very much on not so much on the lighter weapons. But at the same time, the European Union has been active also in that area to control things. The moment, for instance, think of Syria, where it was not just about weapons of mass destruction, where it was about conventional weapons. But you're absolutely right that it needs more attention.
Clara, if you would like to, because then HEINZ maybe. All right, so I think here we can wrap up a little bit. We spoke a lot about the NPT. We also mentioned at the end the CTBT and its meaning for nuclear disarmament, and it probably being the least common denominator for everyone and the support that it enjoys worldwide. We also spoke about the Article 6 and how it actually is not being implemented still. But again, we talked about the NPT and its role in non-proliferation, and the treaty really stopped further proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world during its whole time of the existence. We, of course, spoke about the EU and the opportunities and challenges it faces in the upcoming years and in the upcoming months. And there is lots to be done, and it's up to, I guess, policymakers and diplomats who are also sitting in this room to take up these opportunities and act upon them. Thank you very much for coming here. We will still serve some snacks and drinks at the back of this room, so stay with us and discuss, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.